So let's take a look at today's bell ringer. And we'll start with the first problem. Just remember that any geometry problem without a picture is a bad geometry problem. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is sketch a picture. And what we're told is that the diagonal in this square has a length of 8 square root 2. And our job is to find the perimeter. So in a square, we have all right angles. We also know that both sides are the same. So I've got a right triangle. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the Pythagorean theorem. So x squared plus x squared equals 8 square root 2 squared. And I do want to talk real quickly about what does 8 square root 2 squared mean? It means 8 square root 2 times 8 square root 2. 8 times 8 is 64. Square root 2 times square root 2 is 2. So 64 times 2 is going to be 128. If you're going to do this on your calculator, please make sure you include parentheses where appropriate. So we'll divide both sides by 2. X squared is 64. X equals 8. But don't forget, we're looking for the perimeter. So the perimeter is going to be 4 of those 8s, which is 32. So let's take a look at the next one. Again, any geometry problem without a picture is a bad geometry problem. So let's sketch a rhombus. And I'll label. You know that BD is 16. And you know that AC is 30. One of the things that we talked about yesterday was that the diagonals bisect each other in a parallelogram. So this part would be 8, that part would be 8, this part would be 15, this part would be 15. And also, in a rhombus, the diagonals are perpendicular. So if you focus on this triangle, we should be able to find a side length. And I'll just go ahead and use the Pythagorean theorem. The directions were to find the perimeter. So we need 4 of those 17s, which would be 68. So today we're just going to review what we've been talking about this week in terms of parallelograms and special parallelograms, which are the rhombuses, the rectangles, the squares. And we're just going to kind of compare them at first in terms of a family tree. So in the beginning, there's a quadrilateral. By definition, that quadrilateral has 4 sides. And the interesting fact about every single quadrilateral, no matter what, is that the sum of the angles in the interior is going to be equal to 360. And that's true for no matter what kind of quadrilateral it is. The next shape that we talked about was a special kind of quadrilateral, which was parallelogram. And by definition, for the parallelogram, opposite sides are parallel. But we also know that opposite sides are congruent. Opposite angles were congruent. Consecutive or next to each other angles were supplementary. And finally, that the diagonals bisect each other. So those were the 5 pieces of information about the parallelogram. The next thing we did was we looked at 2 special parallelograms. One of them was a rhombus. By definition, a rhombus is a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides. So all of these 5 rules applied, but also all 4 sides were congruent. We also learned about the rhombus that the diagonals are perpendicular, and the diagonals bisect opposite angles. The vocabulary word that is most appropriate for rhombus would be equilateral. The other special parallelogram we talked about on the other side was rectangle, which is a parallelogram with 4 right angles. And its only interesting fact was that the diagonals are congruent. And the most appropriate word to describe rectangle would be equiangular. Then we talked about the square. The square is both a rhombus and a rectangle. All the rules apply to a square. Another way to think about this is a square is a regular quadrilateral. Which means it's equilateral, equiangular, and regular. Regular would be the most descriptive. So we've talked a lot about these various properties, and we thought it might be useful to have this little chart thingy just to kind of sum things up. Just to let you know, because we've learned so much over the last couple of days, the correct completed chart will be provided on tomorrow's quiz. Just for tomorrow's quiz, though. Do not expect to see this chart on the test. So tomorrow's quiz is not going to be so much asking you to memorize what those properties are, but can you use the properties in these problems once you know them? So the chart is what you're going to be given tomorrow. So I think it's not too bad to think about going across. So which shapes are both pairs of opposite sides congruent? Well, all of them. Which ones are opposite sides parallel? That's a parallelogram rule, so that's all of them. Both pairs of opposite angles congruent. That's a parallelogram rule, so it's all of them. Is it true that the diagonals bisect each other in a parallelogram? Yes, so that's all of them. Are all consecutive angles supplementary, the ones that are next to each other? Well, if it's true for a parallelogram, it's true for all of them. Which shape is special and has congruent diagonals? The rectangle, which means it's also true for the square. Which shape has perpendicular diagonals? The rhombus, which means also the square. Which shape has both diagonals bisecting opposite angles? That was the rhombus, so it's also the square. What about all the angles on the inside equaling 360? Well, that's quadrilateral. So as long as it has 4 sides, it's true. Which shape has all right angles? A square and also the rectangle. And then which shape has all congruent sides? A square and also the rhombus. So, the last type of question we're going to look at is these check all that apply. So if you're looking at this shape, we're just paying attention to the tick marks. It doesn't matter what the picture looks like, it only matters what you can prove. So in this particular picture, I see 4-sided figure with opposite sides congruent. Which shape is that? What do you think? It's actually just the parallelogram. It doesn't say that they're equal to each other. There's no right angle symbol. The only thing I can be guaranteed of is that it's a parallelogram. Now, what about a parallelogram with a right angle? Well, it's definitely a parallelogram. But we don't know that all the sides are equal. We just know opposite sides are equal. So which is the shape that's a parallelogram with a right angle? The rectangle. And the most descriptive name I would give it would be rectangle. Here we have all 4 sides are the same with a right angle. Its most descriptive name is a square, but it's also a parallelogram, a rhombus, and a rectangle. For the last one, the only thing we know is that all 4 sides are congruent. We don't know if there's a right angle, though. So it's definitely a parallelogram, definitely a rhombus, and the most descriptive name would be rhombus.